since I read Stephen Pressfield's wonderful book, The War of Art, Act of Will, War of Art. His book is about resistance. And when he and I met, soon after I read the book, uh, uh, he heard that I was talking about Yetzer Hara, and he took a class of mine, and we realized that what he called resistance, I called the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is a larger term than his idea of resistance. He's specifically speaking about writer's block and more generally, people not pursuing what their soul insisted they pursue, and realizing there's actually an active force of resistance. Now, that's how we understand the Yetzer Hara. It's not just that I'm lazy, that I'm procrastinating. Something in you is producing an opposite will to our will to do what we ought to do. So something when a person says, "Well, I'm being lazy," I say, number one, don't insult yourself, and number two, there's a war on. There's a war on, and there's a force in you that does not want you to fulfill yourself. It's much more serious than procrastinating. You're a battlefield. So first of all, the poem matches in many ways what I wanted to talk about tonight, not surprisingly. And that's a deeper spiritual, more spiritual process of what I'm going to call the conquering of fear. So just to repeat a few things that were said earlier, let's talk about this idea of fear. So I defined in my brief summary of my teaching that fear has to do with, I think most importantly, an inner opposition to our doing what we ought to do. Now I'm being a bit judgmental here because I do have a sense of what I think people ought to do in Israel now in many situations. I've been studying it for a long time. Some of my assessments are really borne out, and I'll give you two examples. There's a lot of fear here, and the fear is not so much the fear of war. In fact, there's a kind of an acceptance now in Israel. People say there's going to be a war. It's going to feel terrible. But you don't feel fear as much as you feel a kind of grim resoluteness that we'll do whatever we have to do. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets ready. Iran has its arsenal. The Israelis say, well, we'll have to fight it off. And there is no other option. If they're going to do what they're going to do, we'll have to do what we're going to do. So as people mention it, you don't detect panic. You detect a sense of, well, it's going to be awful, but we're not going anywhere. It's interesting that as I've spoken with people, there's more fear about the demonstrations in the United States and in other parts of the world. So war is not producing as much fear as the hatred. And in a sense, the war is a fact of the Middle East. The hatred is so new. The idea that there's this stored up anti-Semitism throughout America and throughout college camp, other countries of the world, we Jews in general and those who support the Jewish people and certainly in here in Israel, it's rather shocking. Now, so then the question is, people say, they say, I might want to leave Israel, not because of the fear of war, but because of being an object of hatred. So that's one thing I've talked to people about, and there's an odd second thing happening here, and I've heard it enough times that, and for me, it's so irrational that I really have had to think about it. In fact, a putative colleague of mine, meaning a reform ordained rabbi who made Aliyah many years ago, just posted a blog where he proposed the following, and I can't emphasize how offended I was when I read it. And the title of the blog was, "Is it time to leave Israel? Is it time to leave Israel? Is it time to jump ship? Is it time This is how I read it. Is it time to desert? And when I read it, it wasn't about Hezbollah. It wasn't about Iran. It was about the current government. Is it time to leave Israel? Because as you see it many times on what I'm going to call the more like we have the center, the left center, the right center, and then there's the more what I'm going to call extreme right and extreme left. And the extreme left in Israel constantly say the following: this is the most right-wing government in Israeli history. One response is, we've only been hearing that for 20 years. So at what point is it the most? Because it seems to always be the most. And then they say the Orthodox are, they're greater part of the population, and soon they're going to be a large majority. And there's a sense that we can't stand that the idea that the Orthodox combination of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, and the religious Zionists, the Datiim, that somehow they'll have too much control over Israeli society, and therefore we have to leave. So there's two kinds of fears that I've been hearing. One is a fear, a dread, an anxiety about anti-Semitism in the world, and at the same time, a real anxiety and dread about the most right-wing government in Israeli history, and a real fear of the Orthodox. So now when I hear these fears, of course, what I want to do is break it down and understand what these fears have to do with one's sense of self. Okay, so I want to share with you a little bit. First of all, fear is a signal. The emotion of fear is a signal that there's something to worry about. Something could really go wrong. We don't ignore that signal. The signal of fear is profoundly adaptive to human survival. When you get the signal of fear, you have to take it seriously. The fear might be about reality, where there might be a fear of something imminent, not as imminent long term, but it's a human emotion, a human feeling that must be taken seriously. But then after you take the fear seriously, it's a signal from our nervous system, a signal from the brain. We have to engage what I'll call the observer mind, which means the part of ourself that is not immersed in the world of emotions, feelings, and what I call ego self thoughts. Now, for newcomers, I have to tease this out a little bit, because there's a difference between what I call ego self thoughts, which are habitual, and higher self thoughts that connect us to what we're going to call the authentic self, the authentic will. Meaning, when I have thoughts, feelings, and emotions that I've trained myself to know are not healthy for me, such as fear, anxiety, etc., I know they're not healthy for me because they might have nothing to do with reality. Now, I know fear is a signal, but it might actually be not connected to reality. So I know that as a fact. So I have thoughts of fear, but then I have higher level thoughts. So we call them both thoughts, but they're two kinds of thoughts. One kind of thinking is separated from the thinking that is intertwined with the feelings and emotions of the unconscious ego self. Now, one of my definitions of a mature person, an enlightened person, is a person who can train themselves to do this. Don't even question the idea that there are ego self thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And then there's a higher self that really doesn't have much in the way of feelings and emotions because it's so crystal clear, but it can examine ego self thoughts, feelings, and emotions and ask, how much are these thoughts, feelings, and emotions connected to reality, and sometimes which reality? So let me share with you as I've used this idea in a few conversations. So one is, I think I spoke about this last week, and I've been encouraged to write this up. So I'm going to write it up and put it in a blog somewhere. People say, it feels like Germany in 1934. I say, it feels like Germany in 1934. Let's focus right there. It feels like it. Why does it feel like it? Images of Jews being harassed on college campuses, Jews being pushed out, Jews not being allowed to enter, Jews being persecuted and harassed. So then my question back is, Yes, it happens. It's awful. How widespread? But because with our media, you have one example of vile anti-Semites going through a subway train in New York, more or less threatening any purported Zionists that might be on the train, which means anybody who supports the right of Israel to exist. As I saw in the video, there's about 20 of them, far outnumbering the people in the subway train. So I call them bullies. What bullies do is they amass a sizable force, either just by themselves, they're a forceful person against one other person, or they amass themselves about innocent people who are not prepared to fight, um, and intimidate them. Now, try to imagine these 20 people who have come to Israel and walked into a battalion of Israeli combat soldiers and said, any Zionist identify themselves. Well, they might not have been killed because they didn't have weapons, but they would have gone to the hospital. They selectively chose a place, a confined place, where they knew the civilians were not prepared to fight, and they intimidated and they feared them. And any reasonable person would have said, I could get up and say I'm a Zionist, but I might get knifed, I might get beaten to death. And that, I think that would be foolhardy. I mean, I asked myself, what would I do? I said, I probably would keep quiet because I don't know what they have in their pockets. I don't know what kind of weapon they have. And I could stand up and be a righteous person and come out with a brain injury or worse. So I probably would have said to myself, I'm not saying anything because I know they're bullies. And I know the people around me are not persuaded to join their cause. I would say the opposite. As you look at the news coverage in New York, there's complete outrage that these bullies would go into a subway train and intimidate the passengers. Now, there might not be a lot of affection for Jews and Zionists among some parts of New York, but everybody knew it was wrong, which I think was one of the reasons that Jamal Brown was so severely defeated in the primary, is that people are really sick of the rhetoric of hatred of Jews and Zionists and this crazy rhetoric of apartheid state and the crazy rhetoric of colonizer. People have gotten to know that this, the missionary side of anti-Zionism called DEI, it's been exposed. There's this political cult, quasi-religious, this combination of hard left, extreme radical left politics and ideology, and Islamism, strange bedfellows, but they're working it. It's become kind of a religion, meaning you can't question it. They won't think about it. They made inroads on college campuses, and large swaths of our country are waking up. Number one, to how profoundly un-American it is and what horrible people they are. When people say to me they're afraid, I would say to them, it's not going to last. They say, how do you know this? It could be Germany in 1934. So you have to remember, Germany in 1934, it was organized by the federal government. It was supported by all the provincial governments. It was governmental policy. In Germany, all of the Jewish professors were expelled. There weren't any Jewish professors expelled. In fact, although I would say institutions of authority were caught rather flat-footed, not knowing how to respond, meaning if this rhetoric would have been against Blacks or LGBT communities, the response would have been immediate. In a way, our institutions are trained and ready to defend those who are what I would say are more regular understandings of marginalized people. It has not included Jews, has not included Zionists. So we weren't rhetorically ready for it. And of course, this new rotten political cult has made inroads for decades. It caught us all surprised and flat-footed. A few university presidents resigned. There's been a lot of pushback. So I see the tide turning. So when people say, I'm afraid to go back to Harvard, they're talking about rape and murder, and I beg people a little bit of forbearance. I said, I really get it. You're really afraid. The words are truly frightening, but I just want to ask you a direct question. I have to really buffer what I'm going to say. How many people have been murdered? How many people have been raped at Harvard? Big pause. What are we actually afraid of? Now, I'm not saying it's not happening. It's happened in France. If I were talking about France, we're talking about something else entirely. About college campuses. These are rhetorical bullies. They're rhetorical bullies. The average student doesn't know what to do because they've never been here before. On one hand, this person is saying Israeli Zionists are evil. They seem very passionate about it. Nobody knows anything because no one knows any history. They don't know anything about rationality, how to think. They're caught. Try to imagine if every college student went to campus, knowing history of the Middle East and knowing how to think rationally and think morally by the principles that I was trying to talk about ever since October 7th. Try to imagine they had a really firm standing. Someone says, you call it, someone said, actually not. And the whole classroom of 50 people said, that's actually not true. That's not what's happening. It's a lie. You're a bully. Shut up. Nobody's ready to do it. So the Israelis who were overseas then felt a great dread. No one's protecting them. And my response was, because no one has been trained to protect them. They don't know what to do. No one knows what to do, which goes back to the idea of use might be able to overcome human nature, if I'm paraphrasing Shakespeare, right? Which means if we train ourselves, we can overcome, if I understand the passage correctly, if we train ourselves, we can overcome our human nature not to get involved, not to take a stand, to operate on fear. So as I tried to bring some rationality to the conversation, then I mentioned how many states have actually outlawed DEI, in my opinion, appropriately. I'm pretty hard line on this. Many people think I'm wrong, that there are parts of DEI that can be salvaged. I don't, because it was created by and propelled by this idea that society is built from oppressors and victims. Israel's an oppressor, Palestinians are victims, and therefore Israel is evil. I just got an email that apparently some high-level official in the Culver City Board of Education has joined this rotten political cult, and nobody knows what to do. No one's ever seen anybody that passionate about anything. Now, I read the email. I think that it's going to take a few months, but they're going to push back. So one role that I've had in talking to people about this fear is to take a breath and ask ourselves, what has happened since the encampments? What happened at the UCLA graduation? What happened at a Princeton reunion? Now, what the other side has at their advantage is they can execute what I call raids, which means they can amass themselves and hit one synagogue as they did in Los Angeles. Now, we can't defend every synagogue against 100 demonstrators. Way over here in Israel, I fault the Los Angeles Police Department, who themselves said, we were told by city officials, not to bring on a strong presence. So I have to ask myself, now, if I'm right, I read it, I don't know if it's true, but it seemed like a terrible thing to me that the LAPD could not distinguish between hostile demonstrators and those being victimized by the demonstrators. Again, I think it's lack of training, not wanting there to be a police riot, or these demonstrators trying to lure the police into a police riot, gain sympathy, and increase their numbers. That's very possible. So from way over here, I don't want to doubt the leadership's decisions of other people unless I have more information. But I want to say about us, it was one synagogue. There's a concerted plan by the haters to attack one synagogue, I think to create fear. It's not exactly terrorism, but it is fear-mongering. So the more I talked about this people, their response to me was, but I feel, but I feel, but I feel, but I feel. I said, I get it. The feeling of anger is a signal we have to pay attention to. But the question is, what is actually happening? A few dedicated, well-trained, radical, hating extremists are taking advantage of civil institutions that operate on the presumption of civility. They're taking advantage of the civility And they're taking advantage that they're operating in the context of woefully unprepared people, intellectually unprepared, and from a character level unprepared. That's my factual analysis. Well, what do we do? It's going to be difficult, but the first thing is, my opinion is, don't fear. Right? Don't fear that a few of them have taken over the conversation in a classroom. You have work to do, which means if you can, talk to every person who's not in this rotten political cult one by one and say to them, I'd like you to look some things up. I want you to look at the history. Look at the other side. So when we come back next year, we'll be prepared. I said to people, and I went on a limb, and I said, there's not going to be any more encampments in August, September, because American college students are profoundly fickle. Yeah, they had a great camping expedition in the fall of 2024. I don't think they want to go back to that in the spring. I'm sorry, in the spring, in the fall. So I could be wrong, but I looked at Black Lives Matter, I looked at other things, and these movements that are, Black Lives Matter, again, rooted in the idea that there are oppressors, there are victims. That's American society. All white people are oppressors, all Black people are victims. They had their chance. They had a good run, and people looked at it, especially many Black leaders that said, it's actually just not true. Whatever racial problems in America, it is not that all white people are part of this white supremacist conspiracy to oppress Black people. It's not borne out by the facts. There is something, but it's not that. So, in my opinion, when people make these outlandish charges that create great anxiety and consternation, people take a deep breath, people come to their senses, they examine things, and sometimes the energy wears itself out. So my prediction is, and I hope I'm right, what we saw in the spring of 2024 is not going to reoccur to the same levels in the fall of 2024. Of course, those committed to this rotten political cult aren't going to give up. I just don't think they're going to have as much purchase. They're not going to have as much grip on society. Now, I want to talk about what's happening in Israel a little bit. I was talking to a few people who said, the most right-wing government in Israeli history. I said, okay. I had one question. What was the most left-wing government in Israeli history? Does anybody know? Nobody knows because it doesn't fit the narrative. Remember, when Israel was founded, it was left-wing socialist governments. Although there was tolerance for the Orthodox, there was really a devaluing of the values of the Orthodox. They were tolerated, but not really respected. It's good that someone keeps the tradition, but it's not for me. So, I remember being here, and there was a secular hegemony of looking down on the Orthodox, and not only looking down on the Orthodox, but looking down on the Mizrahim, the immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East. That the Ashkenazi power elite, socialist and secular, looked down upon the religious and Jews from North Africa and the Middle East. It's just a fact of life. Now, what I said to the person I'm talking to is, did they leave? Did they say, well, there's a secular majority, so we're leaving? The seculars are running the country to our dissatisfaction. Are we going to get up and go? I said, they didn't. Why not? I mean, if you're going to leave because the religious might have more power, why didn't the religious leave when the seculars had more power? I think it's a fair question. And I think the answer is, I think for the religious at those times, they grew up in it. They knew how to deal with it. They knew they were in a hostile environment. They knew they weren't liked or respected. The Mizrahim knew that the Ashkenazi power elite devalued them and didn't respect them. But they didn't flee Israel because of that reason. Many things were done, including winning the election of 1977 under Menachem Begin. By the way, I was in Israel at that time on a kibbutz, and what the kibbutz member said is, it's a fascist takeover. I said, excuse me? They said, oh, Menachem Begin is a fascist takeover. I said, based on what? Well, he's a fascist. Same language now. So whenever anybody talks about it, I say, wait a minute, use your words carefully, because those words have meanings. First of all, define your words carefully. What exactly are you afraid they're going to do? And are they doing it? Okay. So people look and say, yeah, thank you very much. This takes about an hour to get through. Thank you very much. I really get it. They haven't said anything that they haven't said anything of which I'm afraid. The haters have said things that make me afraid, such as they're fascist. But I look at what they say; they don't say anything fascist. So you're right. My fear of them is a little bit perhaps exaggerated. They said, but nevertheless, I'm secular. Why would I want to be in a country where the values of the country are not my values? Fair question. Say, okay, forget about fear. I took a deep breath and say, well, that's the way they lived for the beginning of Israel's history. I said, but there's another reason. There's another reason why you should stay in this country, even though it doesn't match your values. Okay. They said, what is it? I said, because we have a Jewish state. We've been dreaming about a Jewish state as a people since the expulsion of the Jews, since the diaspora in the first century CE. I remember growing up in a Zionist-oriented conservative synagogue, the actual dream, hatikva, the hope, liot Yehudi, to be a Jew in our land, right, in the hatikva. And if you look all throughout the Bible, people say that Zionism and Judaism are two different things. Well, the word Zion is in the Bible. We're here. And you want to leave because the game's not going your way. You want to take your toys and go home because you're not winning the game of politics. That's enough reason to abandon the vision of a Jewish state after 2,000 years of diaspora and oppression. You don't like the government, so you pack it in and go away. Now, a rabbi wrote a blog that said, maybe it's time to leave because we're not getting our way. I got to tell you, folks, I didn't say anything. The only comment I made on the rabbi's Facebook page was, he said, maybe it's time to go. I wrote, it's time to make aliyah. That's all I said. Very proud of myself that I restrained myself that much. But I was really taken aback, and I've heard it from many people. Maybe it's time to go. I'm afraid that I won't like the government. So I'm going to leave the country as opposed to stay and fight for my values. Now, I had to think to myself, what kind of people say, instead of staying and fighting for my values, I just want to go home. I want to go home, meaning leave home. So as I've talked to people, one thing I've realized on the first one is they're afraid and don't have a plan, meaning what is our plan to take back America, take back our college campuses, to change minds? Well, as I mentioned, after October 7th, it's a 30-year plan, but we have to do it. And I think there's lots of good people who are leading that fight. Hopefully, I'll publish a few things here and there that will be part of it. What I find here is no sense of duty and destiny. So I could be wrong, but as a Jew, I feel I have something of a duty to work for the right of Israel to exist and do what I can to support that. And I have a duty to stay, whatever's going on inside of Israel, we have a duty to stay and work it out and not weaken Israel by leaving. So then I was talking mostly to young people, and I said to them, duty overcomes fear. Duty overcomes fear, because once you know what you have to do, you then just diminish emotions and feelings that are getting in the way of your duty. Once you know what your duty is, I mean, I think duty has an ultimate calling for Meirav and me. We have to be here with our daughters. If Israel's under siege, we're not going to watch our daughters be in danger from Los Angeles. That was a primary duty as parents, duty as supporters of Israel. The scar of October 7th is everywhere in Israel today. And to stand shoulder to shoulder with a grieving nation that will probably be grieving for the rest of our lifetime. A duty to be with our grieving fellow Jews. And by the way, the grieving isn't only among Jews. I mean, Rav has had many more conversations than I've had with Israeli Arabs and others, and they're disgusted by the world buying into Hamas Iranian rhetoric and say, what about Saudi Arabia? What about Egypt? What about Jordan, who have made peace with Israel? They only listen to Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. They actually don't listen to most of Israel's neighbors who want to coexist with Israel and don't hate Israel. Why do Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah? Why are they governing the conversation? So even among the non-Jews in Israel, there's kind of a disgust against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. All right, so I'm sharing with you what I'll call the rational side of this. I'll give you just I realize I've used up all my time, but I want to give you an introduction to the spiritual side of this from Psalm 16:11. I'll read it to you and then I'll explicate it more tomorrow. This is one of my favorite passages to read. That is a foundation of what I'll call the deeper parts of wisdom work. Psalm 16, verse 7. I will bless God who advises me. Also at night, my inner life instructs me. Okay. Now, when I go inside with some kind of deep dilemma, I don't hear voices. But when I settle myself into my core inner spirit, the depths of my authentic self, it's as if something emerges. And it does feel holy. It feels godly. It's not something that I feel I've created. It feels something that I've made space for. So I'm translating this to mean when he says, God advises me, that but in my interpretation, the author doesn't mean that the author hears voices. The author means that there's some kind of divine instruction available when we're able to push out all of the ego states that interfere with our connection with the divine. And when you have a connection with the divine, you know what you must do. You know what, in a sense, the divine commandment is, and which feelings are actually conducive to what you must do. So there's the feelings that afflict us, and then there are feelings that are conducive to our duty. It's a strange thing to realize you select the feelings that help you do your duty. The feelings that come up by habit are not your only feelings. They're the ones that are involuntarily forcing themselves upon you. You don't have to accept them. You can say, thank you for your vote. Thank you for your signal. I've looked at you and you're not helping. You're not adaptive to my doing my duty, to God, to myself, to my family, to others. And therefore, I will push aside negative ego states that are interfering with my doing my duty. Once we have this sense of the divine will emerging within us, and I will adapt feelings that help me do my duty. So this is Finley's reading of Psalms 11:7. I just want to go back down to verse 11. I'll talk about more of this psalm tomorrow. Look in verse 11. It says the following: Todi'eni orach chaim, instruct me in the path of life. Now try to imagine there's something called orach chaim, the path of life or the path of truth. But we need to be instructed because the unconscious ego self, beset by fear, anxiety, resentment, hatred, all these other things, they're not living in the path of life. They're taking us on an orach, a path far, far divergent from an authentic path of truth. That's just a statement of the human condition. The author says, Todi'eni, instruct me in the path of life, meaning there is something called the orach chaim, the path of life, and there's something called instruction, and somehow the instruction emerges from the soul. So I take this utterly seriously. What if there's an instruction available to you that is in the depths of your soul, but you have to clear out the space for the instruction to emerge? Now, what does fear have to do with it? What does fear have to do with the path of life that you have come to understand because it's a knowledge of the soul? Well, you have to take the fear seriously. It's a signal, but it's not determinative. It's not decisive. Now, the next two words I'll end with tonight, because it says the following. It says, Sova smachot et panecha. Sova smachot et panecha. Sova, savea in Hebrew means to be satiated. Right? You've eaten all the food you can, but not more than you're supposed to. And you're utterly satiated, which means you're not hungry. You're not hungry. Smachot is the plural of simcha, which means joy. Okay? Being satiated by joy. Now, our physical body can be satiated by food and drink. Our spiritual body is satiated by joy. And again, the way I understand joy is not only a response to something, an external uh, catalyst, meaning I'm joyous because of that. Rather, it's also a cultivated inner state. So sova smachot, or the sova of simchas. Now we say simchas like a brit milah or a wedding. I really mean moments of great joy. Now this reminds me of many of the poems that we read. So I'll try to wrap this together. When I decide to go down into that authentic self that's connected to the soul and guided by spirit, and I immerse myself in it, one of my most authentic feelings that comes out of it is incredible joy. Whatever I'm going through, and there's been times where I feel, and we've gone through some kind of dark times. However, my soul's intact. Life wasn't going my way. My soul was intact. I just didn't know it. And so I sink down into my soul, and my soul says, life is not going our way. Life is objectively rough right now. However, my soul is intact. My soul is joyous. I don't quite understand it, but I think it says this. My soul says, this is something else that we get to confront as an image of God. Another part of life to go through. So my soul is filled with joy in the presence of the divine, and now it's get to work, and now it's do our duty. Now, as you lift yourself up from that level, yeah, then it's do your duty, and that can be grim and resolute. But underneath that, there's this sova smachot. There's this fulfillment of the joy of knowing the duty that comes from your soul. It's a very, very deep thing. So I'm echoing my talkings from last week. I talk about virtue, talk about wisdom work, rationality, processing well, doing our duty. I think this summer, what I want to emphasize is that those habits, those practices make room for our ability to connect with the sova smachot, the fulfillment of happiness coming from within us. So one reason we practice wisdom is so that we can clear mental and spiritual space to go down deep inside. And once we go down deep inside, we connect more clearly with our duty to live virtuously and rationally so that we can perform, fulfill what I'll call our more existential duties. So my message to all of us here is, while I've focused on a kind of a stoic, do your duty, wall of virtue, be rational, try to wrangle with those discordant ego states. It's tough work, it's daily work. It opens you to something, an indescribable joy of experiencing an intact soul. And then when you experience the intact soul, all of this other work that we're doing makes much more sense, because there's a lineup between the work of virtue, the life of the soul, and the work of virtue. All right. And again, it's a wonderful psalm, and I want to explicate it a few more, because I think if I'm going to give teachings, if I give you a text to work on as well, it makes the teaching more available to you, that you say, well, what was that teaching? Let me go to Psalm chapter 11 verses, chapter 16 verses 7 to 11, and then it becomes part of your practice. So one thing I want to do is, whenever I give my teachings, I want to link it to a biblical passage or verse, so that they become part of our religious practice of studying text, with the goal of our development as human beings on every level.